Good morning. It is so good to see everyone here this morning and to hear all the conversation bubbling up. It is going to be a good day. My name is Naomi Nelson. I'm the director of the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library here at Duke, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the celebration of the life and legacy of Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. This event accompanies an exhibition that is just across the hall in the Mary Duke Biddle room. It's entitled An Open Mesh of Possibilities, Thinking Queerness with Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick's Archive. And I hope that you'll have a chance to take a look at that today if you haven't already. Sedgwick, a poet, artist, literary critic, and teacher, is perhaps best known as one of the founders of queer theory. She was a faculty member here at Duke in the Department of English from 1988 until 1997. And she was responsible for helping to establish this institution as an intellectual leader in the critical study of sexuality. So it is very fitting that her archive has found a home here in the Sally Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture. As we get started, I would like to take a minute to thank the many people and programs that have made today possible. Hal Sedgwick, Sarah McCary, and the Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick Foundation have collaborated with the staff from the Sally Bingham Center for over 10 years in preparing the archive for transfer here to the Bingham Center in 2019. Over the past year, they have worked together to envision and realize this exhibition and symposium. The Duke Departments of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, the program in Literature, the Department of English, and the Franklin Humanities Institute are joining the Duke University Libraries to co-sponsor these events and exhibit. We also have funding from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation that sustains and nurtures our excellent exhibition program here in the libraries, and we're grateful to them for that support. The exhibition was curated by Catherine Carithers, a PhD student in English, and she was also given some assistance by Laura Mickham, the director of the Bingham Center. And they were joined by many esteemed faculty and library staff members. And I encourage you to take a look at the acknowledgments panel in the exhibition for a full list. Robert Wegman provided guidance for the exhibition and event. And I'll also note that Robin is teaching a course that she designed around the exhibit and archive centering Eve's work titled Eve's Archive Reading Sedgwick. I'd also like to thank Ranjana Khanna, director of the Franklin Humanities Institute, and Professor Jennifer Nash for their sustained support throughout the development of the exhibition and program. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Jennifer Nash, who will offer opening remarks. Dr. Nash is the Jean Fox Obar Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies here at Duke, and the Margaret Taylor Smith Director of that program. She earned her PhD in African American Studies at Harvard and also received a JD at Harvard Law School. She is the author of 4 books, all published by Duke University Press: The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography; Black Feminism Reimagined, After Intersectionality; Birthing Black Mothers; How We Write Now, Living with Black Feminist Theory, and also the editor and co-editor of many books and series. So please join me in thanking our sponsors and welcoming Dr. Nash.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Laura Mickham for inviting me to speak this morning. Thanks to Katie for all of your work curating the exhibit. It's so wonderful to be here. I know how much work it takes to organize an event like this, so thank you, and I hope you're feeling relieved and happy. When Laura invited me to participate, she asked me to share a few words on gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, scholarship, and teaching at Duke University. I admit that I felt a sense of dread when I read her request. How to speak about a moment when most of my energies as both feminist scholar and department chair have been devoted to ensuring that our field and that our department live on. These are indeed precarious times to be a feminist scholar housed in a gender and sexuality studies department. As you all know, much of the current political moment is organized around dismantling what we do, around dismantling critical thought itself, by which I mean expertise, evidence, truth, inquiry, facts, and research. And much of this political moment is structured around erasing even the very evidence that we were here. I think of the ongoing erasure of the facts of queer life, Black life, and so on from federal websites as just one example of this sustained effort. How, I thought, do I speak about feminist scholarship and teaching in a moment when there is a systemic state effort to undermine the very teaching of gender and sexuality and Black studies and critical ethnic studies, when the scholarly work that we do was first marked as woke and indoctrination, and now as dangerous and against state policy. At the same time, channeling the spirit of today, this moment makes me all the more aware of the importance of archiving our scholarly and pedagogical work. This archive is evidence of what was here, the decades of scholarly work, research and publications, department and program building, journal editing and conference planning and execution, and evidence of the hard and sometimes contentious and sometimes fraught work of building and sustaining an interdisciplinary scholarly field. I think of the work of Patricia J. Williams, the scholar who I am always thinking with. She insists that part of the effort of Black feminist theory is to insist that we were here, that we were all here. The immensity and intensity of the effort to undo our work is both unsurprising. We can remember this was promised to us during the campaign, and it's also staggering. The effort that is required to simply keep going, and what's more, to resist, is demanding, exhausting, and utterly necessary. This moment, too, is part of our discipline's history, and it is crucial that we archive it, even as so much of the work that's happening to stay alive, to keep writing, to keep thinking in public requires that we do it quietly, behind closed doors, off-campus email, in unarchived ways. We must find ways to preserve and tell the story of how we are keeping the field alive, because it is part of the larger story of our field, which is our precarity, our struggle for institutional legitimacy, and the intensity of the backlash in response to the institutional foothold we secured. So for me, the task of offering an account of gender and sexuality studies at Duke allows me to mark the sheer amount of work that has been done here to make an enduring institutional space for the study of gender and sexuality, one that emphasizes a plurality of approaches to feminist theory and method. So what is it that we in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Duke do? And some of you in this room are friends, so already know much of this, but I'll rehearse it because I think it's important. Our department has become increasingly interdisciplinary. Our unit now houses faculty whose research touches computer science, anthropology, Asian American studies, Middle East studies, Black studies, art history, and documentary studies. We just completed a tenure track hire in feminist science and technology studies that will allow us to deepen our connections with global health and bioethics. We have a dedicated secondary faculty that expands the reach of our primary faculty to philosophy, music, Latin American studies, Romance studies, German studies, and religion. If feminist theory is our faculty's shared language, it's one that we are now speaking in a wide variety of tones and intonations. Our robust graduate certificate program with its 50+ students is evidence of how doctoral students in departments across the humanities and social sciences center gender and sexuality studies in their research and teaching. And each year, we offer undergraduate and graduate courses that cover topics including feminist theory, gender and science, gender and health, digital feminisms, queer theory, hip-hop feminisms, and women in the political process. For nearly 2 decades, we've run a vibrant postdoctoral fellowship that brings 2 fellows to our campus annually. To date, we've hosted nearly 30 fellows, which is pretty amazing. This program has allowed us to learn from the cutting-edge work of recent graduates in the field and to build our network of feminist scholars who have an intellectual connection to Duke GSF. What has long defined our unit is that we operate as both an academic department and a research center. In addition to our undergraduate and graduate courses, we offer a robust slate of programming that shapes intellectual life at Duke and beyond. We have an annual research theme. Next year, a very timely theme, feminism and the culture wars. The research theme structures our annual fall GSF 960 course, which is a reading group of graduate students, postdocs, and faculty. We host an annual Black Feminist Theory Summer Institute, which will convene this August for the 4th time. That event gathers 8 senior scholars, this year including Patricia Williams, Kara Keeling, Calvin Warren, and Amber Musser, and 20 graduate students from around the world for a week of lectures and discussions about contemporary Black feminist theory. And in a few weeks, we'll host our signature event, the 18th Annual Feminist Theory Workshop. Since its inception, we have hosted leading feminist scholars, including Hortense Spillers, Denise Ferrara da Silva, Lauren Berlant, Donna Haraway, Catherine McKittrick, and Christina Crosby. This year, we welcome Nicole Fleetwood, Farah Jasmine Griffin, Sophie Lewis, and Linda Zarilli. That event is on March 21st and 22nd in Penn Pavilion, around the corner, here on Duke's campus. I warmly invite you to join us. Registration is free and on our website. In addition to FTW, our other most visible public event is our Queer Theory Lecture to honor Eve Sedgwick. This annual event allows us to welcome, celebrate, and think alongside the most incisive and provocative scholars in queer theory, and to honor one of queer theory's most incisive and provocative critics, Eve Sedgwick. The Sedgwick Lecture has brought scholars including Lynn Huffer, Marlon Ross, Samuel Delaney, Joshua Chambers-Letson, Susan Stryker, and Lee Edelman to our campus. Thanks to support from Health Sedgwick, these talks are archived on our website and are accessible to students and scholars around the world. I should note by way of conclusion that our long history at Duke, we're now 42 years old as a department, is due to the, thank you, is due to the visionary work of our first chair, Jean Fox O'Barr, and the organizing and contributions of alums, financial contributions, who created the nation's first endowed directorship in women's studies, the Margaret Smith Taylor Directorship. It is also due to the visionary leadership of the chairs who came before me, all of whom worked tirelessly to create the intellectual culture of our unit, and who all continue to participate actively in the life of our department. So Robin Wiegman, Ranji Khanna, Priscilla Wald, and Jocelyn Alcott. Our unit has also survived and thrived because of partnership with other crucial sites of feminist knowledge production on Duke's campus, including the Sally Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture, thank you, and Duke University Press, I know Courtney's here, who I would like to thank for their central role in feminist publishing, which is to note the fundamental importance of many series to our field, including Theory Q, Next Wave, and Black Outdoors. These critical contributions have made and will continue to make Duke a vibrant place for interdisciplinary feminist research and teaching. So it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Adam J. Frank. Dr. Frank is a professor in the Department of English Language and Literatures and Associate Dean of Policy in the Faculty of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies at the University of British Columbia. He is the author of Radio Free Stein, Gertrude Stein's Parlor Plays in 2025, and Transferential Poetics, From Poe to Warhol from 2015. He is also the co-author with Elizabeth Wilson of A Sylvan Tompkins Handbook and co-editor with Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick of Shame and Its Sisters, a Sylvan Tompkins reader. He has also produced a number of audio or melodramas in close collaboration with composers. Please join me in welcoming him today.
Thanks. Hi. First of all, many thanks to Catherine Carruthers and Laura Mickham for inviting me to speak to you today. When I received an email from Katie at the end of last summer, I was very pleased to be thought of for the event, most grateful for an opportunity to return to Durham and Duke for the first time since I was a graduate student here 30 years ago, and immediately accepted. I can now say with both clarity and conviction that I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Initially, I had thought this was an invitation to give a talk on my ongoing research, which is linked by way of many transformations to the work that I began with Eve Sedgwick on affect theory in the 1990s. I'm developing a project titled Mad Science, a survey of motives for criticism that returns to the countertransference, an idea and technique that gets refined in the British School of Object Relations Theory, oriented especially by the work of Wilfred Bion in his connection with mid-century history and philosophy of science. I'm seeking an alternative trajectory for psychoanalysis in the theoretical humanities via what I'm calling twisted naturalism. So some of the literary figures would include Poe and Zola and Kafka, and then oddly, Nathalie Sarraute and Richard Wright and Mary McCarthy. So we'll see what happens. Sedgwick's work on motives for reading, and especially her late essay, Reality and Realization, are all important touchstones for this project. But I'm not going to talk about any of this today, not directly. Laura had let me know in an early Zoom conversation that this event was open potentially to a fairly wide public, so I agreed with her suggestion to speak more personally about my connection with Eve. This would be more appropriate to the occasion. She and Katie may recall that I registered some distress at this idea, a pang of worried anticipation of the pain of churning up old memories and complicated feelings of loss and identification. I turned 58 2 weeks ago, the age Eve was when she died in 2009. So I didn't exactly relish the prospect of a re-encounter with paths taken and not taken in my emotional, intellectual, and professional lives. But alongside this kind of self-protective recoil, I noticed a smaller feeling, an intuition that, painful though it may be, there's likely something valuable in returning to Eve in this more personal mode at this time, when so many of us across areas are trying to develop what I think of as a critical subjectivism. Anyway, the distinction between the personal and the professional seems barely to have held for Eve, who made present to those who knew her, like no other, the stakes of criticism in thinking itself. Not primarily a scholarly talk then, and certainly not a survey or overview of Eve's multivalent work, her foundational contributions to feminism and queer theory, to sexuality and affect studies, her remarkable essays on Proust, James, Austen, her editorial projects, her forays into North American Buddhism and pedagogy, her activism, her breast cancer journalism, her memoir writing, poetry, fabric, and book art. All or most of these represented by distinctive objects selected from the archive and on exhibit today. Listing these areas can't begin, of course, to do justice to the qualities of her engagement, so today I'll try to convey a sense of some aspects of Eve's poetics, to think with the objects, ideas, and artifacts that she left us. My primary focus will be her memoir, A Dialogue on Love, from 1999-2000, an account written in haibun form, a mix of prose and haiku poetry, of her therapy with Shannon Van Wey, which began in Durham in 1992. The period of this therapy to treat a depression following her initial breast cancer diagnosis coincided with my time at Duke and our collaboration on Tompkins' affect theory. I recently dug up printouts of a series of emails from '93 that Eve and I exchanged when we started writing on Tompkins, which I just handed to Laura earlier today. In response to my having sent her a few paragraphs on weak and strong theory and the analog-digital distinction, she wrote, quote, "The possibilities and applications absolutely bristle," to use one of James's most highly and rather mysteriously eroticized words. A lot of the pleasure of this talk will be reading from Eve's work. So, bristle turns out to be one of three words that stood out for me when rereading A Dialogue on Love, words that connote qualities that we encounter more generally in Eve's archive, the other two being delicate and rescue. I'll try to unfold these qualities, meanings, and motives that accompany them. Bristle. The erotics of bristle may not be all that mysterious given its etymology and meanings. As a noun, it refers us to stiff hairs that grow on the back and sides of a hog or wild boar, used by medieval European brushmakers, or short hairs thickened and stiffened by shaving. Connected to a series of words in Middle and Old English, Low German, and other related languages, its meanings swirl around prong, edge, burst. If some animals raise their quills as a sign of anger or excitement, small muscle contractions which bring blood to the surface, then to bristle means to be actively or aggressively astir with, its transitive use to ruffle violently or exasperate. So these various meanings come into contrastive play right away in Eve's first encounter in an office waiting room with the person who will become her therapist. The quote, "The grotesque, reassuring shock of Shannon, hovering down a few stairs into this view, mild and bristling, with his soft gray nap, big-faced, cherubic, barrel chest, long arms, short legs, Rumpelstiltskin-like. Mild and bristling, both reassurance and threat, angel and imp, Shannon appears on the scene as a fairy tale figure replete with ambiguous powers and textures. As it turns out, he will help Eve spin straw into gold to dis and re-entangle a host of memories, feelings, and fantasies into a more serviceable arrangement that can meet her changing needs. But at this very early moment in the book, Eve's questions, and therefore the readers, are, will she be able to receive his help? Can she suss out Shannon's sexuality? And most importantly, is he stupid? If so, therapy would be unbearable, for as she writes, quote, "In the real world, stupidity isn't a lack, but an aggressively positive entitled presence, and to chafe my own mind and psyche raw against it would be cruel medicine." Eve leaves this first appointment with two competing senses. One is highly verbal and involves what she calls scornful private words, fatuous, complacent, stupid, fiercely devaluing phrases that she describes in haiku form as a storm driving hail seeds and mica flakes of snow against the deep hill. The texture is sharp and rough, bristling. But her other sense is nonverbal, a soft texture conveyed by way of a memory of a photograph from Scientific American. Harry Harlow's famous baby monkey experiments and the terry cloth mother that the babies imprint on instead of the spiky wireframe contraption that provides milk, puffy, fluffy. For Eve, bristling is associated with devaluation and the power of criticism, smart, aggressive, turned on, uncomfortable. It comes with many pleasures, even while these are murkily involved with feelings of abandonment. A few chapters in, we have more bristling, this time after a session that introduces the topic of Eve's SM fantasies and their disappearance post-cancer treatment, and her, to put it mildly, disappointment when Shannon proposes that she rent some porn videos to help relight the fire. This misstep brings forward some useful material in the therapy, as such missteps do, including a discussion of how Shannon's usual methods of encouragement don't seem to work for Eve. Quote, instead they cause bristling or sensations of being dropped. Earlier, when Eve sets the familial scene before Shannon and the reader, we move once again between the puffy and the bristly in the descriptions of her parents. In the uppercase letters that give typographical form to the notes Shannon kept during the therapy and that he has given Eve permission to use, we read about her fear of her father, how he would get angry, puffing up, and turning red as if about to explode, but not physically violent. Her mother, by contrast, gets this haiku, quote, vocabulary list: nuance, ambivalence, gamine, wistful, brisk. I hear a bristle in wistful, brisk. Eve sublating her mother Rita's investments in ambiguity and imagination by way of a commitment to sharpness, complexity, and nuance directed towards more realistic or ethical or political ends. The erotics of bristle in Eve's work arrive with the motive or fantasy of making people smarter. This is a major theme or topos of the book. The precocious responsibility that Eve felt as a child for bringing forth her mother's best interest and intelligence to interact with her, and which extends to Shannon, to her colleagues and students, or really to almost anyone. She associates making people smarter with writing and also with spanking, a primal scene that she writes about in her essay, A Poem Is Being Written. Tugging on this thread in a dialogue on love begins to unravel the family romance. She repeats several times in the book, you don't understand, you can't understand, I'm exceptional, my parents are the emperor and empress of Mars. A dynamic between Eve and Shannon that leads to some heavy-duty transferential conflict. Shannon writes, I feel stupid and also sad that I cannot give to E what support I have to offer. E experiences the situation as more broad-based abandonment, a familiar situation in which she is told that she is too smart or anomalous on her own and is left to figure it out by herself. When Eve learns that her therapist does not, as she puts it, vibrate to the chord of SM, this makes him seem utterly alien to her and at the same time offers her some strange vantage point, a chance for new alchemies and admixtures. The very real differences between Shannon and Eve appear throughout the book. For example, Eve says, I try and try, but I never succeed in getting Shannon interested in genius or even in brilliance. It's an area of possibility and pathos that leaves him cold. He's more interested in the idea of talent, quote, the difference in specificity of talents even in the same person. I'm drawn to these passages where Eve sees an alternative to the omnipotence of genius by way of the everydayness of talents, how a person's talents also involve the many characteristic ways in which they might be stupid or resistant. For me, a beautiful deconstruction of the binary smart, stupid, and a diffusion of agencies and identifications. I continue to find this idea helpful in part because as a graduate student, I fully absorbed the critical motive of making people smarter. Who couldn't? I remember very clearly when I lived in New York briefly in the late 90s and was, among other things, looking into television writing as an alternative career path, having a conversation with a then friend who was apprenticing as a TV producer on a clever animated show. I ventriloquized Eve and said something about how television could or should be a way to make people smarter rather than playing only to the so-called lowest common denominator, which this is still the age of network television. And looking at me with skepticism and contempt, he said, do you really think you can make people smarter? I still do, sometimes. When I think of intelligence not as a trait but a talent that can be nurtured or cultivated, an emergent phenomenon contingent on enabling conditions. Some of these conditions include the magnetic field of knowledge and power that Eve describes at various points in her writing, a polarizing field from which perspective stupidity becomes an entitled presence that amplifies her bristling response. But I've found differently useful a much less Foucauldian account of the phenomenon of thinking as relational and contingent. In Wilfred Bion's writing, as I've made use of it in readings of Henry James and Gertrude Stein, thinking becomes a function of the infant-mother dyad and the projective and introjective movements of identification that take place to create an apparatus for thinking that can itself be internalized. This is a hopelessly compressed summary, so excuse me, my apologies. Bion thinks of thinking as motivated by an encounter with absence, experienced as the presence of strong negative affect and fantasy. Thinking happens when these powerful negative feelings can be tolerated, contained, and modified without being stripped of meaning, and returned to the infant in the environment of what he calls reverie. I read the erotics of bristling in Eve's Poetics as associated with the fluctuations and precariousness of thinking, the challenge of encountering the fundamental frustrations of loss, absence, missed connection, and the opportunity for avowing these. This encounter requires the company of others, what Eve calls in a set of haikus about going places with her older sister, my favorite pronoun, the dear first person plural. She goes on, promiscuous we, me plus anybody else, permeable we. There have been so many of us plus ones, some here today, some no longer with us. Michael, Jonathan, Katie, Mandy, Jose, Brian, Jennifer, Jonathan, Gus. I'm just naming my peers when I was here as a student. So many who have bristled with Eve and try to stay with her in that form of reverie we call reading. Delicate. It's strange that I had to re-buy a dialogue on love a few months ago. This has happened to me more than once or twice. This book keeps disappearing from my shelf. I must be giving it away, although I can't now recall who exactly to. I seem to need to share it, to bring yet more of us together, to give others the chance to experience it as I have. Of course, losing this book is also a sign of my resistance, that part of my love that pushes back on this book, and I experienced more of that this time. Resistance, that famous psychoanalytic concept, the crux of the talking cure that leads toward inner conflicts where psychotherapy can possibly be effective. Eve's book itself revisits that bossy but still useful Freudian term. As she prepares to leave Durham to give lectures in the Midwest, Eve tells Shannon about her fear. She feels compressed, flattened, with no interiority. She has lost a third dimension. He suggests that to Eve that, quote, it might wake me up from this bad dream feeling a little if I can get up and push against someone. A shocking suggestion given the classic therapy protocols of no touching. Soon enough, they are both on their feet, hands on hands, trying to push with our little might to force each other a step or two backward. After a couple of tries, I immediately do feel better, embodied in quite a new way, dimensional, powerful, not scared. So that was a good intuition Shannon had. Eve goes on to associate her fear and rage with her father's anger, quote, that it could never have occurred to me to resist or push back against him. A productive session. Shannon writes down his home phone number for Eve to take on her travels. She puts the piece of paper in her pocket, then promptly puts her pants in the wash when she gets home. A wistful story about the inevitability of ambiguity and resistance in therapy, but also about physicality. The way psychic conflicts are realized or made manifest in and as bodily experience, and how bodily experience can sometimes loosen these same knots. Eve's fine-grained attention to Proustian dynamics, the super subtle ways that our bodies and psyches configure themselves together and dissociate apart from one another. This quality of attention is what I mean by delicate. Delicate is a borrowing from a Latin word whose meanings include immoderately fond of pleasure, luxurious, self-indulgent, sumptuous, pampered, frivolous, fastidious, elegant, unmasculine, dainty, and so on. It's news to me just how much this word ranged across the spectrum of queerness in all of its historicity. In English, delicate means fragile, fine, subtle of persons, objects, or movements, sensitive or refined of a person or an instrument. Eve liked to describe herself as the laziest diva in the world, as if laziness were somehow an enabling condition for her perceptual superpowers, the refinement of her instruments of avowal and description. This is both an ethics of perception and perhaps a queer femme epistemology. In our first session, as Eve seeks clues to Shannon's sexuality, she knows that he wears no wedding ring, that there are no photos of wife and kids, and writes, but couldn't that be from reticence or delicacy? Still, if delicacy, that would itself please and suit me. He doesn't look delicate or gay. He looks more like a guy. She goes on to wonder, how could someone like that have learned to think or feel? Seemingly, he's not even Jewish. Invoking, minoritized subjectivity as a condition for critical thought. But Shannon is not there to criticize. In tact, training, technique, gut-level insight, and honesty, these are therapy's bread and butter. When it works, alongside the pain of encountering old defenses and serious regrets, come new possibilities for pleasure. Delicate has this as its earliest set of now obsolete meanings: delightful, pleasurable, beautiful. And this is how Eve experiences Shannon's office at the very beginning, Space, not only light with sun and canister lighting, but if there's an appreciative way to use the word light, L-I-T-E, metaphysically light. When she commits to this scene of therapy at the end of the chapter, it's at least in part to the peony sunlight of this office, a space, I think, whose warmth and atmosphere promises a delicacy of appreciation that can so easily be lost in the face of bristling criticism. Delicacy by no means precludes the perception of painful truths. Here's one. Halfway through the therapy, Eve brings up the topic of what she calls her over-idealization of friends. The habit she has, as one of those friends puts it, of scattering sequins over us all. Shannon agrees, and there's a long silence. Often it's sobering to be agreed with, she says. A vowel which accompanies an ethics of delicate perception can make one feel dispirited. When she wonders, is all this Bob Mackie glamour holding on to one big lie? Shannon suggests that that's only part of it, that it improves the environment at the same time that it's a defensive idealization. There's no real choice to be made in the movement between sparkly sequins and ordinary light, enchantment and disenchantment. The most significant trajectory of the book and the therapy that it narrates is its movement toward the ordinary, a movement that relieves the family romance's pressure on exceptionality. The possibility of taking pleasure in the ordinary, of being nourished by it, begins to appear with more frequency. In this same chapter, we read about Eve's admission to Shannon that she documents their meetings. It's a pleasure and satisfaction to me to keep a record. They discuss various uses of record keeping for Eve, as authority, as proof, as exhibition of being loved, which triggers a childhood memory. Quote, in particular, I'm now remembering one patch of dirt in my elementary school yard, wandering around the periphery one recess, of course, instead of playing ball with my age mates. I stood staring at and intensely willing myself, yes, this I will remember. This I will project forward into the future, so that it's there as much as it is here. Just this, not because it's exceptional, but because it's ordinary. It's nothing, it's dirt. I will remember it. A powerful memory and a memory of power. Eve breaks into tears as she registers, among other things, the gap between the adult now loved and listened to, and the child who felt unloved and alone and omnipotent. A writer is remembering and communicating her motives for the record. All this record keeping takes place in the context of Eve's fears, hellish dreams of doing something terrible and not being able to undo it, gothic fears that require constant vigilance, bristling intelligence, and delicacy of perception. These punitive fears begin to loosen their hold, if unevenly, over the long course of the therapy. In a late chapter, after considerable discussion of her SM fantasies and what accompanies this formally increased space on the page for Shannon's uppercase notes, Eve tells him, I don't seem to be animated by that old fantasy of making you smarter. That isn't feeling like an exciting experiment now. If anything, I'm more struck by the banality of what I'm bringing to you, and of course the banality of my resistance to it. It's as if the therapy is letting Eve discover accessible forms of nourishment, pleasure in the everyday. Eve's ordinariness may be difficult for some of us to accept, but as a dialogue on love seeks to tell us, it's the complex condition of our loving her with a realistic love. As Klein has suggested, idealizations are inevitable and crucial, arriving in infancy with our omnipotence and need to defend ourselves against the endogenous dangers of the death instinct, to split the good from the bad, to keep the one inside and project the other outward. So much psychic and bodily energy goes into our defensive organizations, what prevents us from expressing our needy, depressive, contaminated love. So when Eve in her therapy is able to utter the phrase, I am pathetically in love with my mother, it's a major achievement. Of course it's embarrassing, she writes, because I've seen myself as such a firm, Oedipal, conscientious objector. And at the same time, she is reassured by the solid, dumb ordinariness of her realization, and the chance to get acquainted with whatever psychic dynamics are loosened up or shaken down as a consequence of this avowal. A delicate ethics of perception then becomes a way to encounter resistances in all their everydayness, their life in our bodies, where denial and disavowal become, from this perspective, both inevitable and contingent. An encounter with the empirical, with the sense that things could have been and therefore could still be otherwise. Rescue. Earlier this winter, I was talking to my own mother about giving this address, Esther, who retired from teaching Yiddish language and literature at McGill a few years ago and will be 89 this spring, recalled the first time she met Eve. This was even before my time. It was during some dinner event that I can't quite work out the details of in Amherst, possibly, that Eve asked my mother about her work, and when she replied, said, "Oh, you're into rescue." This bothered my mother, who has her own complex feelings about her work, as we all do. But perhaps Eve would have appreciated it if my mother had had the wherewithal simply to say, "Takes one to know one." So far I've discussed an erotics of bristle and an ethics of delicate. Now I'll try to say something about a politics of rescue. Clearly, rescue as a motive plays some important role in Eve's queer poetics and critical practice. In a dialogue on love and elsewhere, these seem connected in ways that I find difficult to specify, but I'm going to try to do a little bit of that now, to Jewish thought, feeling, and disidentification. Part of the difficulty is the sensitivity of this topic in the current reactionary political environment, where all discussion of Jewish topics lead back to Israel and its catastrophic destruction of Palestinian life, and where the near impossibility of accommodating vast negative affect and fantasy has contributed mightily to a contemporary stripping away of meaning. More generally, though, I'm extremely wary of rescue fantasies related to my own diasporic Jewish and male disidentifications. The first thing I wrote after defending my dissertation was a teleplay adaptation of Charles Brockden Brown's Somnambulism, a Fragment, an early American short story in which a young man falls in love with a woman he has just met. When she unexpectedly leaves, he dreams of rescuing her from attack as her carriage travels through a Pennsylvania forest, then wakes up to learn that she has in fact been shot in the woods, and of course it turns out he's the sleepwalking killer. Surprise, the title is right there. I titled my own teleplay adaptation Skew, a nod to how easily rescue fantasies go awry, themselves expressions of murky destructiveness. My own script modified the story, the beloved doesn't die in the end, to enact, of course, yet another rescue. This is a recalcitrant fantasy. So we all know the meanings of rescue: to set free, to deliver out of the hands of enemies. The word comes from Anglo-Norman, to shake out or down, to seize. And the violated passivity of the shaken or seized object is central to its meanings. The idea of rescue shows up early in a dialogue on love, in the second chapter, when Eve unfolds her persistent sense of safety in the thought of death, her, quote, reproach against my parents for having made me be born. This is followed by the first appearance in the book of Shannon's uppercase notes, his description of her, quote, wish to die or no longer be. What strikes me is the passivity and the sense of being rescued by death, says Shannon. What emerges over the course of the therapy is how often Eve's wish to make people smarter or her idealization of friends are also developments of and defenses against the image of being rescued by death, the Oedipal dynamics of merger and loss of boundaries. When Eve brings Shannon photographs early in the therapy to set the familial stage, it's the Kosofsky household's Jewishness that forms part of the backdrop. A middle-class 1950s family in Dayton, Ohio, their Mediterranean good looks, quote, all with fine brown frames and those sparkling or soulful, extravagant lashed eyes of chocolate, all but a dorkily fat, pink, boneless middle child. One of my worst nicknames is Marshmallow. I know, horrible. In her fat pinkness or whiteness, Eve is and feels out of place and seeks to disappear. Quote, in the pictures from Dayton, I'm never quite there. It's as though I might will my whole being into my fingertips and from them into something else through touch. A stuffed panda, my other hand, a book or cat, the fabric of a skirt. It's a delicate disappearing act. Eve's sense of herself as exceptional gets unfolded in these early scenes of radical unbelonging. So it's a powerful narrative moment when she arrives at the therapeutic insight fairly late in the book that her family romance is, in a sense, reversed. She has worked so hard to persuade her parents that she belongs with and to them in the face of their perception of her as an uncanny changeling. In a remarkable couple of pages, Eve relates her childhood family situation to her personal, professional, political, academic engagements, specifically her relation to queer stuff. Okay, in each case, imagine somebody who expends extortionate amounts of energy trying to convince the members of some group, not a particularly privileged group, not a high-status group, in fact, a clannish, defensive, stigmatized, but proud, and above all, an interesting group, that she too is to be accepted as, and in fact truly is, a member of this group, a kid, a Kosofsky, or later gay. but each time it's in the face of some inherent, in fact, obvious absurdity about the claim. So it's not easy to specify how the long history of Jewish assimilability and non-belonging are playing out in Eve's overdetermined description of these groups. I sense some pressure exerted by a certain kind of affect script associated with the absurd comedy of Jewish male self-abnegation, what Tompkins would call a power recasting script centered on shame. Some famous early 20th century examples might include Groucho Marx's "I refuse to join any club that would have me as a member," or Franz Kafka's "What do I have in common with Jews? I hardly have anything in common with myself." I wonder whether Eve was able, from the vantage of her feminism and assimilation into post-war America with the relatively privileged position it afforded Jews of European ancestry, to transform this script of self-abnegation into a very different one of vicarious group identification, of vicariousness at the core of queer. So I'm not sure. I can't quite follow this up here on this thought, which would require much more of a sociological perspective than I'm offering in this talk. Instead, I'm going to go all the way back to axiom 7 of epistemology of the closet, which states the paths of allo-identification are likely to be strange and recalcitrant. So are the paths of auto-identification. In this section of Introduction Axiomatic, Eve describes the importance of narrative of a directly personal sort in attempts to disarm the categorical imperative of ethical pressures on identification, to answer questions about the, quote, strong group identification across politically charged boundaries, whether of gender, of class, of race, of sexuality, of nation, that have given her so much sustenance and will provide so many others with tools and ideas to think across the open mesh of possibilities of our symposium's title. Eve invites precisely the kind of personal narrative that she goes on to offer in A Dialogue on Love, and that we have become more familiar with in critical discourse, how some of us seek to write now. I'm nodding to you, Jennifer Nash. Eve gives several reasons for engaging personal narrative, the first of which is directly related to an inverted politics of rescue, which I can't take up at this time, so please accept this as a little IOU. But here's her second reason. Quote, I also wanted to offer, though on my own terms, whatever tools I could with which a reader who needed to might begin unknotting certain overdetermined impactions that inevitably structure these arguments. This is so Eve. Anticipating a reader's struggles with her writing, making space, but on her own terms, for those acts of criticism that we, her readers and colleagues, will inevitably perform. Here, the professional logic of contributing to the ongoing conversation meets the personal and political recognition of the limits of any such contribution, and the necessary role that specific motives play in creative work where insight and blindness or clarity and confusion arrive together. Brief conclusion. I've been thinking a lot about a scene from Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's 1945 film, the gorgeous romantic comedy, She Knows Where She's Going, ! The female lead and main protagonist, played by Wendy Hiller, a socially ambitious Londoner, is trying to reach a remote island in the Hebrides, where she plans to marry a Scottish laird. On a small boat during a wicked storm, crashing waves sweep her luggage into the waters. Her wedding dress flies out, and she watches as her dreams sink beneath the sea. Not to worry, of course, for the boat pilot, the film's male lead turns out to be something of a laird himself, and the storm will clear an emotional space for their connection, the expression of more basic mystic and bodily needs. The feeling of being afloat in a boat, near a maelstrom, in a violent storm, while the engine has died, and we struggle to take it apart and fix it, to bail ourselves out while navigating the waves and shuddering movements of the craft. It's hard not to hear this simply as a description of the state of things. And there's a strong temptation to gaze helplessly at the storm. I'm trying to focus on the craft, the vehicle, the contemporary profession or vocation of literary criticism, which, strangely enough, has come to be my vocation of all things. I found it difficult to sort out what in my own thinking and practice hasn't already been informed or imbued by Eve's efforts to improve our critical ecology. I've been doing some of that today. Something I discovered when I taught a graduate seminar 15 years ago that surveyed Eve's work was that the turn to affect comes directly out of her chapter on Wilde and Nietzsche in Epistemology of the Closet, and its exploration and critique of the discourse of the sentimental anti-sentimental, a double bind that, she argues, structures so much modern thought and feeling. Rereading this chapter, it becomes clear how crucial Eve thought it would be for any serious project of revaluation of values, whether genealogical, phenomenological, or both, to have an account of emotion distinct from Nietzschean ressentiment or Freudian repression, that orients us toward ecological questions of system and environment, of survival, nourishment, and poesis. This is the movement of thought that my work has participated in or tried to participate in. In Eve's archive, we encounter bristling criticism, delicate attention, and a politics of rescue acutely aware of its own destructive impulses and motives. We may not know where we're going, but we can turn to our archive to stay connected with those verbal and nonverbal realities that we critics can't assume that we have exceptional access to, a poetics that gives expression to our ordinary contaminated love. Thank you. So now I'm just going to introduce our next speaker, our curator of the exhibit, Catherine Carithers. Catherine Carithers is a fourth-year doctoral candidate in English and pursuing a certificate in feminist studies at Duke. Her dissertation project focuses on representations of desire in 19th century British novels, and her research interests include queer theory, contemporary gender and sexuality studies, post-colonial studies, and psychoanalysis.
Good morning, everyone. First off, thank you all for coming. I'm thrilled to be here to celebrate Sedgwick's work and to explore the pathways opened by her formidably and delightfully expansive and varied archive. As Adam said, my name is Catherine Carithers. I'm a fourth-year doctoral candidate in English, and I had the immense pleasure of working as the primary curator for this exhibition, working closely with the true force that is Laura Mickham, director of the Sally Bingham Center and curator for the Gender and Sexuality History collections. Secondly, I'd also like to thank the Graduate School and Rubenstein Library, whose summer internship fellowship and fall internship made this curatorial position possible, and specifically the Sally Bingham Center, Rubenstein Library Research Services, and Exhibition Services. One of many joys of working with the Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick papers is a sense of witnessing not only thinking information, but a creative and intellectual life that's deeply animated and enlivened by a community of friends, scholars, students, and colleagues. So it's felt wonderfully fitting that this experience has been of working with a truly incredible community of scholars, archivists, technicians, object conservators, and librarians who have made this exhibition and symposium possible today. I'd like to thank Robin Wiegman, who has been the intellectual interlocutor for this exhibition since the beginning, and whose incisive feedback and guidance has shaped this project at each step, as well as Taylor Black, Jason Edwards, and Kim Lamb, whose conversations and feedback were all inflection points at kind of key moments in this exhibit's formation. And then lastly, to Hal Sedgwick and Sarah McCary. It's been an incredible experience working and collaborating with you on this project. And from our conversations, this exhibit has been shaped and formed. So today, I want to talk through some of the guiding questions of the exhibit and give a little background on how I came to work with Sedgwick's archive. Because for the past year, the question that's kind of shaped our conversations has really been how to think with Sedgwick through her archive. What does it mean to be thinking queerness with her archive? In particular, in kind of not opposition to, but alongside published works and writings. My work with the archive started about 2 years ago through Rubenstein Library's Archival Expeditions program. During archival expeditions, graduate students use archival materials to develop a pedagogical module for an existing undergraduate course. I was in my second year at Duke, starting to kind of dig into those field formation questions that are prompted by qualifying exams. And the previous spring, the Bingham Center had announced that the EKS papers were now open to researchers. So under the guidance of Research Services Librarian Brooke Guthrie and my faculty sponsor, Gabriel Rosenberg, we started to design a module for Intro to LGBTQ Studies course. So kind of came into this with thinking about the pedagogical role of the archive, both in that kind of moment of being a graduate student, this question of what graduate studies and being a literary critic is supposed to be or possibly can be all about. And what it also means to be kind of situated in a course that is teaching a discipline of LGBTQ studies and what that looks like. And And what became quickly apparent in the archive that in addition to the kind of exquisite intellectual richness of the collection, was a striking kind of twofold sensation. That on one side, Sedgwick's archive was challenging at least my, I think probably more generally, but definitely my conception of archives and archival collections, as well as my position as a researcher in relation to archival objects. And then secondly, that Sedgwick was the exact kind of unique, particular thinker that I felt compelled to turn to work through these questions. And maybe that's how papers work more broadly, but it felt particularly resonant sitting in the archive. And Sedgwick, of course, is a thinker, among other things, of intimacy, recognition, and identification, as well as the affective textures of interpretive practices, all questions that play into the archival kind of encounter. For instance, to kind of concretize this a little bit, if we're thinking about the role of surprise in reading practices, which comes up in paranoid and reparative reading, as well as the Weather and Proust, and kind of throughout her thinking, it's difficult to anticipate what a box or the inside of a box will look like as you're working through it. This is a practical and logistical question. I mean, even at the time in 2023, I was still primarily working with the text-based boxes, which is around those first 30 boxes or so. These would be the Duke office files, correspondences, research files. And part of this emerges from how writing, creative practice, pedagogy, research, correspondences, personal and professional, are so tightly interwoven. In the office files, looking at the labels, which are taking what was once a physical space and moving it into a alphabetical list in some ways. Correspondences to contemporary colleagues or current research on the work of contemporary scholars are nestled between 19th century writers like Charlotte Bronte or Henry James, and it's difficult really to know what you're getting into when you open a folder. Since then, now that Sedgwick's textiles, her works on paper, ceramics, and small art objects are open to researchers, this sensation has only heightened. Rachel Penniman has brilliantly designed and worked with the containers to house these three-dimensional objects, and now it's really quite incredible when you open a box of the kind of ways of thinking and creative modes that you're going to come across when you're in the room. Another example, and possibly to overgeneralize archives for a moment, and thinking about this idea of an archive, archives often seem to promise some kind of access to a previously undisclosed interiority. Personal correspondence is separated out from professional correspondence. There's a lot of mixed correspondence in this archive. Published works are now readable alongside conversations, ideas, and projects that were not previously made available to a public audience. And one possible response is to kind of resist or disavow that promise. And yet, Sedgwick's archive asks us to attend to the ways in which the personal textures her scholarly writing, the way she insists on the personal in the scholarly form. And it asks you to ask, what is the role of sentiment, of identification, of recognition in the moment in the archival encounter? How do you read the personal? How do you bring yourself into the room? So this project ended up, this older one, condensing around epistemology of the closet. The module focused on a few themes that's continued when we started having conversation around the exhibit to guide it, around kind of thinking, information, a historical specificity grounded in the 80s and 90s, both as the moment of field formation of queer theory and also of the AIDS crisis and sexual politics of that period, as well as this kind of question of the kinds of archival intimacy, so that question of the personal, of recognition and sentiment. So I think there's a way in which the act of orienting yourself in Sedgwick's archive is this invitation back into her thinking. This experience with the archival encounter shaped our early conversations around the exhibit, and this question of what does it mean, what does it feel like to move outward from the archive into Sedgwick. So for the first layout, which was really kind of pulling the objects onto tables in the reading room to get a visual sense of the collection, we had about 80 or 90 objects, with the goal of aiming for about 30 to 35. And so in narrowing down, we knew we wanted to keep certain aspects of the archive highlighted. For instance, pedagogy. though there's now only one syllabus. Another would be her poetry and poetics and kind of poetic sensibility that continues to pattern throughout her work. The writing in progress, those drafts and iterations of the poems, as well as that historical specificity. And then the second main question was around the central goal of the exhibit for a public audience. As some of you know, Rubenstein Library exhibits are designed for a public audience. That's the main audience that we're speaking to in the labels that the exhibit is bringing people into the space for. And one of the aspects of Sedgwick scholarship that's so remarkable is that amid these kind of dazzling close readings with sentences which are intricate, theoretically dense, and kind of demand that you sit with them, at the same time, there's an incredible precision and at times laconic clarity. I'm thinking particularly of her questions, the lists and tendencies in Weather and Proust, as well as the axioms that so quickly condense and kind of distill this idea that then gets drawn out by her. And so the big question of the exhibit is, what do you want to communicate to a public audience? As described in the introductory panel, we focused in on representing queerness as a sensibility and not a settled identity, as Robin highlighted. A sensibility that's shaped by the particularity of the AIDS crisis and response, and specifically within the moment of the 1980s and 1990s. A sensibility shaped by feminist thought, by a specific literary studies method and training, as well as a poetic sensibility. So we tried to focus on exploring the multifaceted ways in which Sedgwick brings queerness as a sensibility into her creative and intellectual life, working across scholarly and creative modes. But of course, with these goals, there's still the looming question of how do you possibly try to represent or distill or narrativize a life into 11 cases and 2 pedestals? And relatedly, how do you conceptually begin approaching that question when the life you're trying to represent, distill, or narrativize is that of someone whose creative and intellectual work keenly interrogates the critical agency of interpretive practice and its relationship to objects of study? And at the end of the day, our kind of main answer was by giving the objects the space. They really do seem to want to talk to each other and be in conversation, and they have things to say when you pull back and give them room. So we have these large themes that we know we wanted to have, literary studies, the kind of big question to return to again, which was so helpful to me as being trained as a Victorianist, but why 19th century books to start off with? Questions of how the AIDS crisis shaped Sedgwick's thinking, specifically her commitment to anti-homophobic inquiry, how illness shaped her thinking, how she's a thinker of mortality, how she worked through queerness, which is at times a retrospective label for certain texts, and she reflects on this in the preface to Epistemology, as well as affect and artwork. But the cases themselves are kind of a distillation and a visual rendering of larger questions and conversations that come up in the archive and that we see as openings into her thinking. An example of this is that when placed on the plane that's similar to the art, what do you notice about the book covers, which are all art in their own right, selected by Sedgwick, and that she had a hand in? How do you visualize a mind at work? How do you kind of bring that texture of this question of formation through notes to elaborate concepts? What happens when syllabi or published works are set beside the notes that lead you to page numbers or have little scribbling on them and that ask you to attend to something maybe different? And this brought us to kind of the centering in the exhibit. We have the open mesh of possibilities, which of course is a kind of as clear of a definition as queerness as we could find in Sedgwick's work and is a productive and generative one often cited. And it's also one that's, we hope, was on the side of partiality, of holding things in suspension, of creating space for there to be gaps and resonances and dissonances within the exhibit, and think of it as a space that is less on the side of creating a hold, but rather opening up ways to move into and out of the archive. This looks like specifically, I'll give one more example, kind of in terms of the affect case. That case came together really around the letter to Simon Watney, where Sedgwick describes she has this new, or kind of burgeoning really commitment to this question of shame. And she talks through the moment of looking in the mirror and looking at her body that kind of brings this question to the forefront of her mind. And then from that letter, it talks about a potential for a piece around a scar, and then moving into fat art, thin art, and then into the portrait image to kind of hold these different objects at different points in time in suspension alongside shame and its sisters, as well as touching feeling, not to kind of overdetermine them in a line, but to kind of draw these sorts of loose connections that the archive seems to let you move into, of thinking with someone who's thinking in that moment. And so lastly, I wasn't quite sure how to conclude this talk. I just to be fully honest, I mean, already in thinking of this curator's remarks as a kind of introduction to the exhibit, I'm extremely drawn to and intimidated by Sedgwick's introductions, the axiomatics in epistemology. I think of the slant in Queer and Now and Tendencies. That was my first encounter with Sedgwick and writing. And I just remember falling into that piece. It was actually during the COVID pandemic, and just sitting with it during that moment. And so in ways of a conclusion, I wanted to just end with a little moment around what this exhibit has taught me as a reader in the process of getting to sit with the archive for the past year. And a lot of it is just the pleasure of being able to linger in Sedgwick's thinking, to go and return back to objects, which is not something I usually associate as being possible with archival work. It's sometimes a frantic trying to look at as much as you can. But it's been a really wonderful lingering that has changed how I read, and how to sit with the different kind of beauty of the sentences and let them hook you and draw you in. And so I want to end as well with, in Dialogue on Love, Sedgwick describes, she says, "What I'm proudest of, I guess, is having a life where work and love are impossible to tell apart." And one of the most striking parts of the archive, I think, is that there's so much life in it, and there's so much showing of the precarious and beautiful and exquisite and delicious work that's in loving and in loving this community that she's so deeply enmeshed in and that you can see there. So thank you.